The world had cracked open for us the day the doctor said, "Cancer." My wife, Lily, sat still in the sterile, white-walled office, her fingers clutching mine like a lifeline. Her bright blue eyes, once so full of laughter, widened in disbelief as the word hung in the air like a dark cloud. I promised her then, with every ounce of certainty I could muster, that we would get through it together. And we did. The months that followed were a blur of chemotherapy appointments, hospital rooms, and whispered reassurances. I became her anchor, holding steady through the storm. I took a leave of absence from work, poured all my energy into her care, and watched as she fought tooth and nail against the disease that had dared to enter our lives. When she lost her hair, I shaved mine too. When she couldn't bear to eat, I sat by her side with a smoothie in hand, coaxing her to take just one sip. We won the battle. Or so I thought. When the oncologist finally gave us the all-clear, it felt like we could breathe again. But it wasn't the same breath we had drawn before. Lily emerged from her fight changed, and I can't blame her. Facing death had given her a new perspective, one I didn't fully understand. She spoke of wanting to truly live, now, to grab every opportunity she could, to shed the cautious person she used to be. I thought I could embrace this new version of her. How could I not, after all we'd been through? But I didn't recognize the woman standing before me anymore. In the months that followed, Lily dove headfirst into a whirlwind of activities. She started saying yes to every invitation, every event, every spontaneous idea that popped into her mind. She spent more evenings out than she did at home, her laughter now shared with people I'd never met. I couldn't keep up. The woman who used to curl up next to me on the couch for movie nights was now an enigma, running toward a life I didn't seem to be part of. "I feel like I'm suffocating here," she said one evening as we sat in the kitchen, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. "I need to feel alive again, Sam. You don't think I feel that way too?" I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. "I was right there with you, Lily. I held your hand through everything. What about us?" She looked away, her jaw tightening. "This isn't about you. It's about me figuring out who I am now." Her words stung, but I said nothing. What could I say? I had no roadmap for navigating a marriage to someone who seemed to have outgrown me. That night, as I lay awake in bed, staring at the empty space beside me, I realized something had shifted between us. The connection that once tethered us was fraying, and I didn't know how to hold on without pulling her farther away. Lily's transformation was like the tide, gradual at first, until one day I realized I was standing on a shore that no longer felt familiar. She was out more often than she was in, and even when she was home, it felt like her mind was elsewhere. She had traded the quiet contentment of our evenings for bustling restaurants, late-night gatherings, and a growing circle of new friends whose names I struggled to remember. One Saturday, she announced she was going skydiving. The idea of my wife, who once hesitated at roller coasters, hurling herself out of a plane stunned me. "Skydiving?" I asked, lowering my coffee cup, the words tasting strange in my mouth. "Where did this come from?" She shrugged, her energy vibrating like a live wire. "Amanda and the group invited me. They said it's exhilarating, life-changing. And why not? Life's too short to say no. What about dinner with the Tanners tonight? We made those plans weeks ago." Lily's smile faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. "Reschedule it. They'll understand. Sam, this is important to me." Important to her. That phrase was becoming her refrain, as if nothing else could hold equal weight. I didn't argue. I couldn't stomach another fight where I felt like the villain for wanting her to choose me, choose us, over her newfound freedom. When she came back that night, still buzzing with adrenaline and recounting every detail of the jump, I forced myself to smile. She kissed my cheek as if the gesture alone could bridge the growing chasm between us. But the scent of the wind on her skin and the way her eyes gleamed made me realize she was living a life I didn't belong to anymore. I busied myself with work to fill the void. My colleagues commented on my late nights and early mornings, teasing me about my newfound dedication to projects that didn't require it. They didn't know it was easier to lose myself in spreadsheets and deadlines than to go home to an empty house, or worse, a house where Lily was but her warmth wasn't. The distance between us began to show in the small things. I'd leave a note on the counter, letting her know I'd picked up the groceries, only to come home and find it untouched. She started missing dinners, apologizing in text messages that always ended with a too casual love you. Sometimes I wondered if she really meant it, or if she just said it because it was habit. Then came the late-night calls. I'd be watching TV, the volume low, and her phone would light up on the kitchen counter with a name I didn't recognize. She'd answer with a cheerful, "Hey, you!" and her voice would drop into that intimate, conspiratorial tone that used to be reserved for me. When I asked, she brushed it off. "Oh, it's just Ethan from the office," she'd say, or, "Amanda's friend, we were talking about the book club." Her casual dismissals chipped away at my trust. I wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that we could still weather this storm, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. I caught myself checking her phone when she wasn't looking, a shameful, desperate act that made me feel like a man I didn't recognize. One night, as Lily slipped into bed after another unexplained outing, I finally asked, "Are you happy, Lily?" She froze for a moment, the covers bunched in her hands, then sank onto the edge of the bed. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Because I don't know if you are. And I don't know if I am either." Her shoulders sagged under the weight of my words. For a moment, I thought she might open up, give me something real to hold on to. But instead, she whispered, "I'm trying to be. I really am." It felt like she'd taken the sharp edge of a knife and slid it cleanly between my ribs. That night, I stared at the ceiling long after Lily had fallen asleep, her body curled away from mine. My mind swirled with questions I didn't have the courage to ask. Who was she becoming? And was there any space left in her world for me? The worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. The unraveling wasn't sudden, it came in small, imperceptible threads that snapped one by one until the entire fabric of our marriage fell bare and frayed. I clung to the hope that things would improve, that maybe the chaos in her life was just her way of finding balance again after facing her mortality. But deep down, I knew we were drifting towards something neither of us could avoid. It was a Thursday night when the tipping point came. I had come home earlier than usual, the grocery bags biting into my hands as I pushed the door open. The house was dark except for the faint glow coming from the living room. Lily's voice carried through the air, low and hushed, a tone I hadn't heard her use with me in months. I set the bags down and moved quietly toward the doorway. She was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, the phone pressed to her ear. A small, wistful smile played on her lips. "I wish you could have been there," she was saying, her voice warm, intimate. "You always know how to make things feel special." My breath caught. I stayed frozen in place, my pulse pounding in my ears. She laughed softly at something the person said on the other end. "Yeah, I'll try. Maybe next week? I'll let you know." I didn't hear the rest. My body felt heavy, like I'd turned to stone. I backed away, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and Lily's head snapped toward the sound. Our eyes met across the room. Her expression shifted, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw guilt flicker in her gaze. She hung up abruptly. "Sam," she said, her voice tight. "I didn't hear you come in." "Clearly," I said, my tone colder than I intended. Her cheeks flushed. "It's not what you think." I cut her off, my hand raised to stop her. "Don't. Just don't." For a long moment, we stood in silence, the air thick with tension. I could see her scrambling for the right words. Something that could undo the image burned into my mind of her on the couch, talking to someone who clearly wasn't just a friend. "Sam, I can explain." She started again, her voice softer now. "Explain what?" I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "That you've been pulling away for months? That every time I try to reach out to you, you're already halfway out the door? Or that I just walked in on you whispering to someone like you used to talk to me?" She flinched, and for a brief second, I saw her mask crack. But then it was back, the defiant tilt of her chin, the defensive stance that had become her default lately. "Nothing's going on," she said firmly, though her tone lacked conviction. "You're overreacting." I laughed bitterly, running a hand through my hair. "Overreacting?" I'm trying to save a marriage that you've been walking away from piece by piece. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes glistened, but she didn't say anything. I waited, hoping, begging for her to fight for us. But the silence dragged on until the lump in my throat became unbearable. I shook my head and grabbed my keys. I need some air. Sam, don't. She started, stepping toward me. I held up a hand, stopping her mid-step. I can't do this right now, Lily. Without waiting for a reply, I walked out the door, the night air biting against my skin. I got in my car and drove aimlessly, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound accompanying the storm raging inside me. My mind replayed the scene over and over, dissecting every moment, every word, every expression on her face. I didn't know how long I drove, but when I finally stopped, I found myself in the parking lot of a small coffee shop. It was late, the neon sign casting a soft glow onto the empty street. I went inside, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window, staring blankly at the world outside. I wanted to believe her, to trust that my fears were unfounded. But the ache in my chest told me I already knew the truth. Something between us had broken, and I wasn't sure it could ever be fixed. As the coffee grew cold in front of me, I realized I didn't just feel betrayed. I felt lost. The woman I had built my life around was no longer the woman sitting across from me at night. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the man she needed anymore. When I returned home that night, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Lily's shoes were by the door, her keys on the counter, but she wasn't in the living room or the kitchen. I found her upstairs in our bedroom, sitting cross-legged on the bed. She looked up as I entered, her expression guarded, her eyes rimmed with red. I couldn't sleep, she said softly, her voice a shadow of its usual self. Me neither, I replied, closing the door behind me. The weight of the silence between us was suffocating. I sank into the chair by the window, the one she used to curl up in on rainy days. For a moment neither of us spoke. The space between us felt insurmountable, a chasm carved out by months of unspoken words and half-kept truths. Finally, I broke the silence. "Who are you talking to, Lily?" I asked, my voice steady but strained. Her gaze dropped to her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. She didn't answer immediately, and the longer the silence stretched, the harder it became to breathe. "Ethan," she finally said, so quietly I almost missed it. My heart sank. I'd suspected as much, but hearing her say it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. "The guy from work?" I said, more a statement than a question. "Yes." She looked up then, her eyes shimmering with tears. "It's not. It wasn't supposed to mean anything." The words hit me like cold water, and I let out a bitter laugh. "That's the best you've got? It wasn't supposed to mean anything? Do you even hear yourself, Lily?" Her tears spilled over now, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. Not yet. Not while my chest was burning with anger, betrayal, and a pain so deep it felt like I'd been hollowed out from the inside. "It wasn't like I planned this, Sam," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't wake up one day and decide to hurt you. I was—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I was lost." "Lost?" I repeated, the bitterness rising in my throat. "You've been lost for months, Lily, and I've been right here. I've been trying to hold us together while you've been out chasing whatever it is you think you need. And this is where it's led you." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to force her to explain why the vows we made had become so easy for her to break. But instead I just sat there, staring at the woman who had once been my entire world and wondering how we had ended up here. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered through her sobs. "I didn't. But I felt alive with him. Like I was someone else. Someone who wasn't just broken." Her words sliced through me like a blade. I knew what she meant, even if I didn't want to admit it. The cancer had taken so much from her, her body, her confidence, her sense of control. And while I had been her rock, steady and unwavering, maybe that wasn't what she needed after all. "Do you love him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face filled with anguish. "No," she said, shaking her head vehemently. "It wasn't love, Sam. It wasn't anything. It was just a way to feel something again. The room spun around me, and I gripped the arms of the chair to steady myself. I believed her. As much as it hurt, I believed that she wasn't in love with Ethan. But that didn't make the betrayal any less devastating. I don't know what to say, I finally admitted, my voice hollow. I don't even know where we go from here. Sam, I'm sorry, she said, sliding off the bed and kneeling in front of me. I'm so sorry. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm begging you to give me another chance. Let me make this right. I looked down at her, this woman I had loved so deeply, who had once been my safe haven. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could fix this, that the love we'd shared could somehow withstand even this. But the pain was too fresh, the wound too raw. I need time, I said, my voice trembling. I need space to figure out if I can forgive you. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll do whatever it takes, she whispered. I'll wait as long as you need. But as I climbed into bed that night, staring up at the ceiling while Lily's quiet sobs filled the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something irreparable had been broken between us. And no amount of apologies could ever put it back together. The days that followed were a blur of forced civility and unbearable silence. Lily tried, she really did. She cooked my favorite meals, cleaned the house like it was a temple, and made small, hesitant gestures to pull me back into her orbit. But it all felt hollow. I couldn't look at her without seeing that moment on the couch, her voice soft and warm for another man. I took to staying out late, claiming extra hours at work, or lingering at a diner with a cup of coffee long after the plate in front of me had gone cold. Coming home felt like walking into a mausoleum, a place filled with memories of love that had been buried under the weight of betrayal. One night, about a week after our confrontation, I came home to find her sitting at the dining table, a bottle of wine half empty in front of her. The dim light above cast long shadows across the room, making her look smaller, more fragile than I'd ever seen her. You're late, she said, her voice strained but steady. I shrugged, tossing my keys onto the counter. Had a lot on my plate. Is that code for avoiding me? She asked, her eyes glinting with a mix of hurt and defiance. I sighed, the exhaustion of the past weeks crashing over me like a wave. I don't know what you want me to say, Lily. I want you to talk to me, she said, standing up and crossing the room toward me. I want to know what you're feeling, what you're thinking. I know I hurt you, but I can't fix this if you won't let me in. Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. I wanted to tell her the truth, that I didn't know if I could ever let her in again, that I wasn't sure I could rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But the sight of her standing there, so raw and exposed, made the words catch in my throat. I'm trying, I said finally, though even I didn't believe it. Are you? She shot back, her voice rising. Because it doesn't feel like it. It feels like you've already made up your mind to hate me forever. Hate you? I said, my own frustration bubbling to the surface. You think I want to feel this way? You think I enjoy looking at you and feeling like I don't even know who you are anymore? Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might cry again. But instead she stepped back, her expression hardening. You don't know who I am because you don't want to. I'm not the same person I was before the cancer, Sam. And maybe that's the real problem. You think this is about the cancer? I said, my voice rising to match hers. You think I stood by you through all of that just to give up on you now? This isn't about who you've become, it's about the choices you made. Choices that tore us apart. And what about you? She snapped. You've been so busy playing the martyr, holding everything together, that you didn't even notice I was drowning. Don't turn this around on me, Lily, I said, shaking my head. I did everything I could for you, everything. And when you needed more, you didn't come to me. You went to him. The silence that followed was deafening. She looked at me, her eyes glistening, but she didn't deny it. She didn't defend herself. She just stood there, as if all the fight had drained out of her. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know how to fix this. Neither did I. That night I slept on the couch. Not because she asked me to, but because the thought of lying next to her felt unbearable. The cushions were lumpy, the blanket too thin, and the room too cold, but it didn't matter. The ache in my chest outweighed any physical discomfort. The next morning, as I left for work, she was waiting by the door. She didn't say anything, just handed me a small envelope. "What's this?" I asked, my tone more indifferent than I intended. "Couples therapy," she said quietly. "I made an appointment. For us. If you're willing." I stared at the envelope, unsure if I felt anger, relief, or something in between. Therapy. It felt like the last card she had to play, and I wasn't sure if I had the energy, or the desire, to go along with it. "Think about it," she added, her voice trembling. "Please." As I walked to my car, I slipped the envelope into my pocket. It felt like a weight, small but suffocating. I didn't know if therapy could save us, or if it was just a way to delay the inevitable. But as I drove away, a part of me couldn't help but wonder if I owed it to the man I used to be, to the love we used to share, to try. Even if it felt like we were trying to rebuild a house that had already burned to the ground. The envelope sat on my desk at work for 2 days, unopened. I couldn't bring myself to look at it, let alone make a decision. Every time I reached for it, a voice in my head reminded me of the humiliation I'd felt, the betrayal I couldn't forget. But another voice, quieter and more persistent, whispered that maybe this was the last thread holding us together. On the third day, during a particularly restless lunch hour, I tore it open. Inside was a printed confirmation of an appointment for the coming Saturday at 10 a.m. The therapist's name, Dr. Helen Monroe, meant nothing to me, but the thought of sitting in a room with Lily, peeling back the layers of our broken marriage, was enough to make my stomach turn. When Saturday arrived, I drove to the office in silence. Lily sat beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed out the window. The tension in the car was suffocating, either of us daring to speak. The therapist's office was tucked into a modest brick building on a quiet street. The waiting room smelled faintly of lavender, and the walls were adorned with soft, muted paintings, meadows, streams, sunsets. It was meant to feel calming, but all I felt was a deep unease as we sat on the stiff leather chairs, waiting for our turn. When Dr. Monroe finally called us in, I was struck by her presence. She was older, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing and a voice that carried both authority and warmth. She gestured for us to sit on the couch across from her chair, and as we settled in, she offered a small, encouraging smile. "So," she began, folding her hands in her lap, "I understand things have been difficult lately. Why don't we start with what brought you here?" Either of us spoke. The silence stretched awkwardly until Lily finally broke it. "I cheated," she said, her voice trembling. "I betrayed him. And I don't know if he can ever forgive me." Dr. Monroe nodded, her expression neutral. "That's a significant admission. Sam, how do you feel hearing her say that?" I let out a bitter laugh. "How do I feel? Angry. Hurt. Like I wasn't enough." The words spilled out before I could stop them, raw and unfiltered. Lily flinched, and for a moment, I almost apologized. But why should I? This was the truth, wasn't it? Dr. Monroe's gaze shifted between us, steady and probing. "Anger is a natural response to betrayal. But beneath the anger, what else do you feel?" I hesitated. What else was there? "Loss," I admitted quietly. "I feel like I've lost her. The woman I married isn't the one sitting next to me anymore." Lily turned to me, her eyes glistening with tears. "I'm still here, Sam. I know I've changed, but I'm still me. I don't know how to show you." The room felt heavy with her words, but for once, I didn't push them away. Dr. Monroe leaned forward slightly. "Lily, when you say you've changed, what do you mean?" She exhaled shakily. "After the cancer, I felt like I was living on borrowed time. I started thinking about all the things I'd missed out on, all the risks I never took. I wanted to feel alive again, but instead of turning to Sam, I turned away." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. But then, instinctively, I reached for her hand. She flinched at first, then let me take it. "I needed you to talk to me," I said softly, my voice trembling with the weight of months of frustration. "I needed you to let me in." But instead, you shut me out. I was scared, she whispered, her tears spilling freely now. Scared that you'd see how broken I was and realize you didn't want me anymore. I shook my head, my own emotions bubbling to the surface. You don't get it, Lily. I never stopped wanting you. Even now, after everything, I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Dr. Monroe's voice broke the silence. It sounds like both of you have been carrying a lot of pain alone. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and rebuilding it takes time, effort, and a willingness to be vulnerable. Lily squeezed my hand, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a glimmer of the woman I'd fallen in love with. But the road ahead still felt impossibly long, and I didn't know if we had the strength to travel it together. When the session ended, Dr. Monroe gave us each a small notebook. I want you both to write down one thing every day that you appreciate about each other, she said. No matter how small. And at our next session, we'll talk about what you've written. As we left the office, the sunlight felt too bright, almost intrusive. Lily glanced at me nervously. Thank you for coming, she said. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. Instead, I unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, the notebook weighing heavily in my pocket. The first step had been taken, but I couldn't shake the fear that it might not be enough to save us. The notebook sat on my bedside table, untouched for days. Dr. Monroe's suggestion felt almost laughable at first. How could I write something I appreciated about Lily when all I could see was the betrayal? But every time I glanced at it, her words from that session echoed in my mind. Rebuilding trust takes time and effort. One evening, after a long day at work, I found myself staring at the blank page. Lily was in the kitchen, humming softly as she chopped vegetables for dinner. I hated how unfamiliar her voice felt to me now, as though I were listening to a stranger mimic my wife. Still, I picked up the pen and wrote the first thing that came to mind: she's trying. It wasn't much, but it was honest. When I slipped the notebook back onto the nightstand, I caught her looking at me from the doorway. Her hands were tucked into her sweater sleeves, and her expression was cautious, like she didn't want to intrude. Everything okay? She asked, her voice tentative. Yeah, I said, forcing a small smile. Just thinking. She nodded, lingering for a moment longer before turning back toward the kitchen. I didn't know if she saw me write in the notebook, but part of me hoped she did. Maybe it would show her I hadn't entirely given up. The days began to take on a strange rhythm. We went to work, shared polite conversations over dinner, and went to therapy every Saturday morning. Dr. Monroe guided us through the wreckage of our marriage with the precision of a surgeon, cutting into the tender spots we tried to avoid. It was excruciating at times, but it forced us to confront the truths we'd been burying for years. One session, she asked Lily to describe what she felt was missing in our relationship before the affair. It wasn't that anything was missing, Lily said, her voice trembling. It was me. I felt like I didn't know who I was anymore. And instead of facing that, I ran. I stayed quiet, processing her words. I'd been so focused on my pain that I hadn't considered hers in that way before. But even as I began to understand her struggle, the bitterness lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Then came the night that cracked the fragile foundation we were trying to rebuild. I was in the garage, sorting through a box of tools, when Lily's phone buzzed on the workbench. It was Ethan's name on the screen. My heart sank, a wave of nausea washing over me. I didn't answer it, but the sight of his name alone was enough to reopen the wound. When I handed her the phone later, my voice was calm but cold. Ethan called. Her face went pale. I didn't know he would. You didn't block him? My tone was sharper now, my restraint slipping. I didn't think I needed to, she said weakly, avoiding my gaze. The anger surged in me, hot and unrelenting. Do you have any idea what it feels like to see his name on your phone? After everything? Sam, it's not what you think, she pleaded, stepping toward me. I haven't talked to him since. Then why is he calling you? I snapped, cutting her off. Why does he still have access to you? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her silence was answer enough. I can't do this, Lily, I said, shaking my head. I can't keep pretending this is something we can fix if you won't cut every tie to him. I'll block him, she said quickly, desperation in her voice. I'll do it right now. But the damage was done. I watched her fumble with her phone, her hands shaking as she blocked his number, and all I felt was exhaustion. It wasn't just Ethan. It was the weight of everything we'd been through, the cancer, the distance, the betrayal. I thought therapy would give us a way back to each other, but in that moment, it felt like we were just delaying the inevitable. That night, as she lay in bed with her back to me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I loved her, I knew that much. But love wasn't the same as trust, and trust was the foundation we no longer had. I felt like I was standing on a crumbling ledge, one wrong step away from falling into the abyss. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a drive. I didn't have a destination in mind, just the need to escape the suffocating weight of the house. I ended up at the park where I used to run before life got too complicated. There, by the lake, I saw her, Carol. She was sitting on a bench with a book in her lap, her dark curls catching the sunlight. Carol was one of the nurses who had cared for Lily during her chemo, and I'd run into her a few times at the hospital. She had always struck me as kind, someone who carried a quiet strength that was easy to overlook until you needed it most. When she looked up and saw me, she smiled, her expression warm and genuine. "Sam," she said, closing her book. "It's been a while." "It has," I said, managing a faint smile of my own. I didn't sit down at first, but she patted the bench beside her, and something about her calm presence made it impossible to say no. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. "How are you?" she asked, her tone gentle but not intrusive. I hesitated, unsure how much to share. But as I met her gaze, I found myself saying, "Honestly? I don't know anymore." Carol didn't press me. She just nodded, her expression understanding. And as we sat there, the stillness of the lake mirrored the quiet in my mind, a momentary reprieve from the chaos of my life. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me that there was still a world beyond the wreckage of my marriage. A world I wasn't sure I was ready to step into, but one that was starting to feel less like a distant dream and more like a possibility. The notebook sat unopened on the nightstand, a quiet accusation in the stillness of our room. Lily wrote in hers every night, her pen scratching across the pages like she was trying to write her way back to me. But I couldn't bring myself to open mine again after the first hesitant entry. The weight of it felt too much, the task too hollow. What was there to appreciate when every glance at her brought back the image of Ethan's name flashing on her phone? She noticed my hesitation, of course. Lily always noticed. But she didn't say anything. Instead, she doubled down on her efforts, trying to fill the widening gaps between us with small gestures. She cooked meals she remembered I liked, left folded laundry on my side of the bed, and even started asking about my day again. It wasn't enough. How could it be when my trust in her had been carved out, leaving nothing but an empty shell? One night, I came home late from work. I hadn't intended to stay late. I just couldn't bear the thought of stepping into the house, of seeing her there, trying so hard and still failing to bridge the divide. When I finally did walk through the door, the faint hum of her voice reached me before I saw her. She was on the phone, and though I couldn't make out the words, her tone sent a chill through me. It was warm, familiar, a tone I hadn't heard her use with me in months. My feet carried me toward the sound before I even realized I was moving. She stood in the kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear. Her free hand twisted the hem of her sweater, and she was smiling, a soft, wistful smile that made my stomach turn. "No, it's fine," she was saying, her voice light. "I'll see you soon." I didn't need to hear the name. I already knew. The moment she saw me, her smile dropped. She ended the call quickly, her cheeks flushing as she turned toward me. "Who was that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Ethan," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt the anger rising in me, hot and unforgiving. "You're still talking to him?" "It's not like that," she said quickly, taking a step toward me. "I didn't mean to, he just called out of the blue." "And you answered?" I shot back. "You didn't block him like you said you would. You let him back in." "I wasn't thinking," she said, her voice trembling. "Sam, I swear, It wasn't anything. I held up a hand, cutting her off. Do you have any idea what it feels like to see his name on your phone? After everything? After what we've been through? Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached for me, but I stepped back. I'll block him, she said, desperation in her voice. Right now. I'll block him, and it'll be over. It should have been over a long time ago, I said, my voice breaking. But it's not, is it? Because every time I try to believe you, every time I try to move on, something like this happens. How am I supposed to trust you, Lily? How? She didn't have an answer. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, her hands hanging uselessly at her sides. I can't do this, I said finally, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. I can't keep pretending that we can fix this if you won't cut every tie to him. I'll do whatever it takes, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know how to make you believe that. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The anger, the hurt, the exhaustion, it was all too much. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, the streets blurring together in the dim light. Eventually, I found myself at the park, the one I used to run through when life was simpler. The stillness of the place wrapped around me like a balm, dulling the sharp edges of my thoughts. I wandered down the familiar path, the crunch of gravel under my feet the only sound. That's when I saw her. Carol was sitting on a bench near the lake, a book in her lap and a thermos by her side. She looked up as I approached, and her face broke into a warm, familiar smile. Sam, she said, closing her book. It's been a while. Yeah, I said, managing a faint smile of my own. It has. She gestured to the empty space beside her. Want to sit? I hesitated, but something about her calm presence made it impossible to say no. I sat down, and for a while, we just watched the water in silence. There was something soothing about her company, a quiet strength that steadied the chaos inside me. How's Lily? She asked eventually, her tone careful, as if she already knew the answer might be complicated. She's trying, I said after a long pause. We both are. Carol nodded, her expression thoughtful. Trying's a start. I looked at her, searching her face for judgment, for pity, but there was none. Just understanding. It doesn't feel like enough, I admitted quietly. It rarely does at first, she said, her voice soft. But sometimes it's all you can do. Her words lingered in the air between us, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. We talked for a while longer, about nothing and everything, until the weight on my chest didn't feel quite so suffocating. By the time I left the park, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. As I drove home, I thought about what Carol had said, her words playing over and over in my mind. Trying was all we could do, but for the first time, I wasn't sure if trying would ever be enough. Coming home that night felt heavier than usual. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that feels deliberate, like it was waiting for me. Lily was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket, the TV flickering softly but muted. Her head turned as I walked in, her eyes searching mine for any hint of where my mind had been. I didn't give her one. Instead, I dropped my keys on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and headed for the kitchen to pour myself a drink. I didn't invite her to follow, but she did anyway, her footsteps soft behind me. Sam, she said cautiously, her voice a thread stretched tight. Can we talk? Talk about what? I said without turning around, pouring bourbon into a glass. About how you keep saying it's over, but somehow it's not. I blocked him, she said quickly, her tone defensive. You saw me do it. There's nothing left with Ethan. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth spread through me before turning to face her. You say that, but it doesn't erase everything that's already happened. It doesn't make me forget. Her arms wrapped around herself, a shield against the weight of my words. I know I can't change what I did, she said, her voice trembling. But I'm trying to fix it. I'm trying to fix us. You're trying, I repeated bitterly, setting the glass down with more force than I intended. You keep saying that, Lily, But how long am I supposed to wait for trying to turn into something real? How long am I supposed to hold on to the pieces of a marriage you broke? Her face crumpled, but I didn't stop. I gave you everything, I said, my voice rising. Through the worst of it, through the cancer, the fear, the nights I didn't know if you'd wake up the next morning, I was there. And this is what I get in return? You telling me you didn't know how to come to me, so you went to someone else instead? I was scared, she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't know how to face you. I didn't know how to tell you that I felt like I was losing myself. Losing yourself? I said, the words like acid in my mouth. What about me, Lily? Did you think for 1 second about what I was losing? About how it felt to watch you pull away, knowing there was nothing I could do to stop it? She shook her head, her sobs growing louder. You think I don't hate myself for what I did? You think I don't replay it every day, wishing I could take it back? I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take the pain in her voice and use it to stitch together the gaping wound in my chest. But the anger, the hurt, the betrayal, they were louder than her apologies. You don't get it, do you? I said, my voice quieter now but no less sharp. It's not just about what you did. It's about what it turned us into. I don't know who we are anymore. I don't even know if we're worth saving. Her sobs broke into silence, her breathing ragged as she stared at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. You don't mean that, she whispered. You can't mean that. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. Because part of me wasn't sure if I did. The love I had for her was still there, buried beneath the rubble of everything we'd been through. But it wasn't enough, not when trust had become an impossible mountain to climb. I don't know what I mean, I admitted finally, the weight of the words crushing me as I said them. All I know is that I'm tired. I'm tired of fighting for something that doesn't feel like it's mine anymore. She collapsed into the chair behind her, her hands covering her face. For a moment, I thought about going to her, about putting my arms around her the way I used to when life felt too heavy. But my feet stayed rooted in place, the distance between us feeling insurmountable. I think we need time, I said, the words barely audible. Time apart. To figure out who we are without all of this hanging over us. Her hands dropped, and she looked up at me, her expression a mix of devastation and disbelief. You're leaving? I don't know, I said, running a hand through my hair. Maybe it's what we both need. Her voice broke as she whispered. I need you, Sam. I don't need space. I need you. But I couldn't give her that. Not anymore. Not when the version of me she needed felt like a ghost of the man I used to be. Without another word, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her sobs to echo through the house. The next morning, I packed a bag. I didn't tell her where I was going, and she didn't ask. She just stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself again, watching as I zipped up the suitcase and slung it over my shoulder. I'll call, I said, though the words felt empty. When I know what I want. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line to keep them from trembling. I'll be here, she said softly. Whenever you're ready. I left without looking back, the weight of her words following me out the door. As I drove away, the house growing smaller in the rearview mirror, I felt a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief at escaping the suffocating tension that had consumed us. Grief at the possibility that this might truly be the end. I didn't have a destination in mind, just the need to put distance between us. But as I drove, my thoughts kept drifting back to the park, to Carol's calm presence, and the way she'd listened without judgment. I didn't know what I was searching for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't something I would find in the ruins of my marriage. I ended up at a motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that felt anonymous enough to disappear in. The room was small, with faded wallpaper and the faint smell of cleaning chemicals lingering in the air. I dropped my bag by the door and collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling as exhaustion finally caught up with me. The silence was overwhelming, but I couldn't bring myself to turn on the TV. Instead, I let the quiet wrap around me, giving space to the thoughts I'd been running from for weeks. Was leaving the right choice? Had I walked away from something that could still be salvaged, or was this just the inevitable conclusion of a relationship that had already died? By the next morning, the restless night had left me groggy but no closer to an answer. I drove to a diner down the road, hoping a cup of coffee and some greasy eggs might bring me clarity. But as I sat at the counter, my mind kept circling back to the previous night. The look on Lily's face as I'd walked out, the way her voice had cracked when she said she needed me. It wasn't until my second cup of coffee that I finally reached for my phone. The missed calls and unread texts from Lily stared back at me, but I couldn't bring myself to open them. Instead, I found myself scrolling through my contacts until I landed on a name I hadn't expected to see there. Carol. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over her name. It felt wrong, somehow, to reach out to her. But at the same time, there was something about the thought of her calm presence that steadied me, made me feel like maybe I wasn't drowning. Before I could overthink it, I pressed the call button. She picked up after the second ring. "Sam?" she said, her voice carrying the same warmth I remembered. "Hey," I said, suddenly unsure of what I wanted to say. I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Is everything okay?" "Not really," I admitted, letting out a shaky laugh. "I left. I left Lily. Just for a little while, but I don't know what I'm doing." There was a pause, and then she said, "Where are you?" "A motel," I said, glancing around the dingy room. "Near Route 36. I just needed space." "I get that," she said softly. "Sometimes you need to step away to figure out what's really important." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled something in me. "Do you think I made the wrong choice?" I asked before I could stop myself. "I think the only wrong choice is staying somewhere that makes you feel like you're losing yourself," she said. "And I think you're brave for admitting you need time to figure that out." Her reassurance felt like a lifeline, and before I knew it, I was asking, "Do you want to grab a coffee or something? I could use someone to talk to." "Sure," she said without hesitation. "There's a cafe near the park. I'll text you the address." The cafe was quiet, tucked away on a side street with outdoor seating that overlooked a small garden. Carol was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a steaming mug in front of her. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, I felt like I could breathe. "Thanks for meeting me," I said as I slid into the seat across from her. "Of course," she said, her gaze steady. "What's going on?" I didn't know where to start. The words spilled out of me in a messy, tangled stream, everything from the therapy sessions to Ethan's call to the endless arguments that had eroded whatever connection Lily and I had left. Carol listened without interrupting, her expression a mix of empathy and quiet understanding. When I finally stopped, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "It sounds like you've been carrying a lot," she said. "And it's okay to admit that you're tired. It doesn't make you weak, it makes you human." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to acknowledge the weight I'd been carrying, to tell me it was okay to let it go. "Thanks," I said, my voice thick. "It's been a long time since I felt like anyone really saw me." Carol smiled, a small, understanding smile that felt like a balm. "You deserve to be seen, Sam. And you deserve to be happy." We talked for hours, the conversation shifting from heavy topics to lighter ones. She told me about her garden, her love of old movies, and how she'd been learning to play the piano in her spare time. I told her about the house projects I'd been neglecting and how I used to love running in the park. For a while, it felt like we were just two people enjoying each other's company, free from the weight of the past. When we finally said goodbye, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Carol wasn't a solution to my problems, and I didn't see her as an escape. But she reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, that I could still feel connected to someone, that there was still a version of me worth saving. As I drove back to the motel, the sun setting behind me, I thought about what came next. I wasn't ready to go back to Lily, not yet, maybe not ever. But for the first time, I felt like I could see a path forward. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but it was there. And maybe, just maybe, it led to something better. The motel room felt like it had grown smaller overnight, the walls pressing closer with every passing minute. I lay on the bed staring at the cracked ceiling, thinking about the conversation with Carol and the strange comfort it had brought me. It wasn't that I saw her as a solution, She wasn't a replacement for Lily or an answer to my problems. But there was something grounding in her presence, a clarity I hadn't felt in months. By mid-morning, I knew I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I packed up my bag and checked out, the faint smell of stale air clinging to my clothes as I stepped outside. I didn't have a plan. The idea of going back to Lily still felt impossible, but driving aimlessly wasn't going to help either. After sitting in the car for a few minutes, I made a decision. I drove to my parents' house, a place I hadn't visited much since everything started unraveling. It wasn't that I didn't want their support, it was that I couldn't bear the thought of their disappointment. But as I pulled into the familiar driveway, the sight of my dad's old truck and my mom's garden, still blooming despite the fall chill, brought a sense of reluctant peace. My mom opened the door before I even reached it, her eyes widening with concern. "Sam? What's going on, honey?" I hesitated, the words sticking in my throat. "I just needed a place to think." She stepped aside without a word, her hand brushing my shoulder as I passed. My dad was in the living room, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he flipped through the paper. He looked up and set the paper down immediately. "You look like hell," he said, his tone blunt but not unkind. "Thanks, Dad," I muttered, sinking onto the couch. "What's going on?" he asked, leaning forward, his expression serious now. For a long time, I didn't say anything. I stared at the coffee table, at the small stack of coasters my mom insisted on keeping neatly arranged, and felt the weight of their eyes on me. When I finally started talking, the words came out haltingly, like I was dragging them over broken glass. I told them about Lily's affair, about the therapy, about leaving the house. I told them about the endless cycle of trying and failing, of wanting to hold on but not knowing how. By the time I finished, my mom was sitting beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly. My dad leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. "Sometimes," he said after a long pause, "it takes more strength to walk away than it does to stay. But only you can decide which one is the right kind of strength for you." I looked up at him, surprised. My dad wasn't one for deep conversations, and his words carried more weight than I'd expected. "I just don't know if I can trust her again," I admitted quietly. "And without that, what's the point?" My mom squeezed my hand. "Trust takes time, Sam. And forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means deciding whether the love you have is worth the pain it caused." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I agreed. The love I had for Lily still existed, buried beneath layers of anger and hurt, but whether it was enough to carry us forward, I didn't know. I stayed at my parents' house that night. My mom made dinner, fussing over me like I was a teenager again, and my dad opened a bottle of whiskey he usually reserved for special occasions. It felt good to be surrounded by people who didn't expect me to have all the answers, who just wanted me to feel safe. The next morning, I woke to a text from Lily. It was short, just a single line, "Can we talk?" I stared at the message for what felt like forever, my thumb hovering over the screen. Finally I typed back, "I'll come by later." The drive home felt like stepping into a storm I wasn't sure I could weather. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as always, but it felt different, like it belonged to someone else now. I walked inside, and there she was, sitting at the dining table with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up as I entered, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi," I replied, setting my bag down by the door. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, the silence stretching between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Finally, she broke it. "I don't know how to start," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't even know what to say." "Then don't say anything," I said, surprising myself with the softness of my tone. "Just tell me what you want." She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the edge of her sweater. "I want us back," she said quietly. "I want to be the people we were before all of this." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "We can't go back, Lily. That version of us is gone." Her head snapped up, and her eyes filled with tears again. "Then what do we do? How do we move forward if we can't go back?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the anger I'd been holding onto for so long was starting to feel less like armor and more like a weight dragging me down. I don't know, I admitted. But I know we can't keep doing this, hurting each other, pretending things are okay when they're not. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. I don't want to hurt you anymore. I don't want to lose you. You already did, I said quietly, the words cutting through the air like a blade. At least the version of me you're holding on to. I don't know if I can be him again, Lily. And I don't know if I want to try. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might break completely. But then she straightened, her expression hardening with a resolve I hadn't seen in months. Then let's be someone new, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. If we can't go back, let's figure out how to be something else. Something better. I stared at her, caught off guard by the raw honesty in her voice. Part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that we could build something new from the ashes of what we'd lost. But another part of me, the part still nursing the wounds of her betrayal, wasn't sure if I had the strength to try. I need time, I said finally. I can't give you an answer right now. She nodded, her expression a mix of hope and resignation. I'll wait, she said. For as long as it takes. I didn't know if I believed her. But as I walked out the door and back to my car, I felt the smallest flicker of something I hadn't felt in months. Possibility. The weeks that followed were quiet but heavy, like the moments before a storm breaks. Lily gave me space as I asked, though her texts came daily, short, careful messages that carried the same unspoken plea, don't give up on us. I read each one and set my phone down without replying, unsure of what to say. I spent most of my time at my parents' house, splitting my days between work and restless evenings in their guest room. My mom hovered, always with kind eyes and a hand on my shoulder, while my dad gave me the distance I didn't know I needed. But even their quiet support couldn't drown out the voice in my head that kept asking the same question, what now? The turning point came one evening when Carol called. We hadn't spoken since that afternoon at the cafe, though I thought about her often, the way she listened without judgment, her calm, steady presence. I answered quickly, glad for the distraction. Sam, she said warmly, her voice like a bomb. I was just checking in. How are you holding up? Better, I lied, though the word felt hollow. She didn't press me. Instead, she asked if I wanted to meet at the park again, and before I could overthink it, I agreed. The park was quiet as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow over the lake. Carol was waiting at our usual bench, a thermos in her lap and a small smile on her face. I sat beside her, grateful for the familiar comfort of her presence. How's the house? She asked gently, her tone careful. I haven't been back much, I admitted. Lily's giving me space, and I think we both need it. Carol nodded, her gaze fixed on the rippling water. Space can be good, she said after a pause. But only if you're using it to figure out what you really want. I looked at her, surprised by the weight of her words. What if I don't know what I want? She turned to me then, her eyes steady. Then maybe it's time to stop focusing on what you're running from and start thinking about what you're running toward. Her words lingered with me long after we parted ways. As I drove back to the motel, I realized how much of my energy had been spent on escaping the pain, the betrayal, the uncertainty of whether Lily and I could ever rebuild what we'd lost. But what was I moving toward? Was it reconciliation? Closure? A fresh start? That night, I wrote in my notebook for the first time in weeks. It wasn't much, just a simple line, I want peace. A few days later, I called Lily. Her voice trembled when she answered, and I could almost picture her sitting at the dining table, clutching her phone like it might shatter. Can we meet? I asked. Yes, she said immediately, her relief palpable. Whenever you're ready. We agreed to meet at the house that evening. When I arrived, the familiar sight of it, the flower bed she used to tend, the porch where we once sat and planned a future, stirred something bittersweet in me. Lily was waiting inside, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She looked up when I entered, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. Hi, she said softly. Hi, I replied, closing the door behind me. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the same place where so many of our arguments had played out. This time, though, the air between us felt different, less charged, more fragile. "I've been thinking a lot," I began, my voice steady but quiet. "About us. About everything that's happened." She nodded, her eyes never leaving mine. And I don't think we can go back," I said, the words cutting through the silence like a blade. "Not to the way things were." Her face crumpled, but she didn't interrupt. I pressed on. "I've spent so much time trying to figure out if I can forgive you, if I can trust you again. And the truth is, I don't know. But I also know that holding on to this anger, this hurt, it's killing me. It's killing both of us." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she wiped them away quickly. "I'll do whatever it takes, Sam," she whispered. "I'll keep trying for as long as it takes." "I know," I said, my voice softening. "But that's not enough. We both deserve more than just trying. We deserve to feel whole again." She looked away, her shoulders shaking as she cried. I let the silence stretch, giving her time to process, to grieve. When she finally looked back at me, her expression was one of resignation but also acceptance. "Are you saying it's over?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I'm saying we need to let go," I said, my chest tightening as I spoke the words. "Of the pain, the guilt, the idea that we can fix something that's already broken. Maybe we'll find our way back to each other someday. But right now, I think we need to find ourselves first." She nodded slowly, tears still streaming down her face. "I don't want to lose you," she said, her voice breaking. "But I don't want to keep hurting you either." We sat there for a long time, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. When I finally stood to leave, she didn't try to stop me. Instead, she walked me to the door, her hand brushing mine as I stepped outside. "Goodbye, Sam," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "Goodbye, Lily," I replied, my own voice thick with emotion. In the weeks that followed, we began the process of separating, dividing the house, the accounts, the life we'd built together. It wasn't easy, but it felt necessary, like a wound finally being cleaned after festering for too long. I moved into a small apartment across town, and Lily stayed in the house, her gardens slowly coming back to life. Carol and I kept in touch, though our conversations remained light and careful. She wasn't a replacement for Lily, and I didn't want her to be. But her presence reminded me that life could go on, that there was still joy and connection to be found even after so much had been lost. One day, months later, I found myself back at the park. The air was crisp, the trees bare, and the lake mirrored the pale winter sky. As I sat on the bench where Carol and I had first reconnected, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. I wasn't the man I had been before Lily's betrayal, and I wasn't the man I'd been during the storm that followed. But I was someone new, someone who had learned to let go, to forgive, and to find strength in starting over. And for the first time in a long time, I was okay with that.